Good morning, my dear colleagues. I'm glad to welcome you from Memphis, University of Memphis. I regret, of course, that at this very moment I cannot be with you in Bochum. But fortunately, because of these wonders of technology, I hope I will be able to communicate to you a few major points I was going to make. And of course, I am videotaping this presentation, but the organizers promised that there might be a chance through Skype to receive a few questions from you, if any, and hopefully I will be able to follow your discussions and your talks through Skype. Who knows? Before I introduce my topic, let me situate Altai both religiously and geographically. So if you look at this map, you will see that geographically it's the very center of Inner Asia. From a religious viewpoint, Altai was the area situated between the world of Islam here in the west. From the north in the west we have Russian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox schismatics, old believers, coming to colonize Altai. And in the west, of course, we have the world of Tibetan Buddhism. So it's an area that got stuck between all these major world religions. Of course, the indigenous religion was shamanism, and in many respects, Altai can be called a spiritual middle ground. Okay, so both geographically and religiously, it was a middle ground. When we talk about Altai, mostly people think about Russian Altai. Okay, and since majority of works, historical anthropological works, is about Russian Altai, but we have to remember that where northwestern Mongolia also is Altai. Okay, so Altaian mountains extending into this southern area. So I'm talking about this area, not only Russian Altai, proper Russian Altai, but also about northwestern Mongolia, Mongolian Altai. Okay, the topic of my presentation is so-called Ak-Jang, or white or milk faith. Why milk? Because milk, white, were the symbol of purity in Altaian mythology, in Altaian spirituality. So Altaians were nomadic stock raisers, pastoral people who raised the stock, and milk, cheese were the major products. So hence this perception of white milk as the symbol of purity. So we have, by the end of the 19th century, tremendous pressure on the Altaians from Russian colonization. It's about 2 million people, and by the end of the 19th century moved to southern Siberia, the far east, and definitely it was a huge land pressure, and a lot of historians, anthropologists correctly argue that intensive Russian colonization was one of the major background sources that prompted the development of this revitalization movement. Okay. By the way, Ak-Jang white faith, it's an example of this. It's a typical revitalization movement described in the classic article by anthropologist Anthony Wallace. I think it's 1955, if I'm not mistaken. His article, Revitalization Movements. Okay, Anthony Wallace. It's a very interesting article, still relevant for our research, I think. In old literature, white faith was called Burkanism. Okay, after Burkhan. Burkhan is a name for Buddha in Mongolian language, and by its nature, white faith is a syncretic movement that incorporated elements of shamanism and elements of Tibetan Buddhism. The movement itself was prompted by a historically based prophecy, so-called Oirat prophecy, that became popular both in Russian Altai and in Mongol Altai since the 1870s. Let me briefly describe to you this prophecy for you to understand what we're talking about here. So by the end of the 19th century, many Altaians and Mongols in Western Mongolia started to spread this prophecy that soon Oirat prince might come and help Mongols and Altaians to escape their enemies, to escape their troubles. And who were these troublemakers from whom indigenous people in Western Mongolia and Altaians wanted to escape? Definitely in Russia it was Russian colonizers, Russian administration. In Western Mongolia it was the fear of the Chinese presence, Chinese advancement, land colonization. Okay, so the prophecy was used for different purposes in these two areas. Another thing for us to remember is that both, and I'm sure you studied this area, I'm sure you know about this. I don't want to insult your intelligence. I simply want to remind to you that this particular area, Western Mongolia, Altai, Western China, they were the part of Jungaria or Oirat Confederation, nomadic confederation, this powerful nomadic state that existed roughly until the 1750s, when it was destroyed by the Manchu troops that unleashed the genocidal warfare against this confederation, and many Oirat clans escaped to different areas. Okay, different areas. So some of them escaped to Altai Mountains and found their protection in the Russian forts, and the Russian Empress Elizabeth accepted some of these bands as her subjects. Okay, that actually what gave rise to the Altaians, who mixed with local people, and we have Altaians. Okay. White faith, milk faith, was focused on transgressing clan borders, transgressing local areas. It was in many respects trans clan religion, in contrast to shamanism, which was heavily clan based spirituality. Okay, shamanism, as you know, is a very anarchistic, I would say, a very individualistic religion, impromptu religion, quote unquote, impromptu spirituality. Shamans serve the interests of clans, unlike white faith that in Altai addressed to all Altaians. Okay, and by the 1920s, white faith became the foundation of ethnicity building in Altai. Okay, so it performed some ethno-religious purposes. Formerly, the founder of this movement was Chet-Chelpan, a humble shepherd. In reality, he was just a smokescreen for more educated people who apprenticed in Mongolia, but who were afraid to be arrested, and that is why they used this simple, humble folk. An interesting part in this new movement, spiritual movement, was played by so-called kaichi, traditional storytellers, who at first they were in the shadow. They were not prominent. Usually some skillful storytellers using a two-string traditional instrument, music instrument called tapshur. They were reciting the songs, long lasting, like sometimes 3, 4, 5 hours, the songs, stories. They were half singing, half telling them songs about old glorious deeds of Airot, of other princes of the nomadic confederation. And they were not prominent. But when shamans were denounced by the new movement, okay, we have to remember that shamanism was labeled as the black faith, so bad faith, in contrast to white milk faith. And shamans were called black faces, okay. So their paraphernalia, their drums were burned, okay, they were ostracized. And some of the shamans, by the way, to escape popular ostracism, started to convert to the new movement, okay. But it was Kaichi, the traditional storytellers, who were in the shadow. Now they come to the forefront, okay. Because shamans were clan-based figures, but Kaichi, they were masters of this popular mythology, which transgressed the clan borders, okay. So they were familiar with this body of knowledge, Oirot mythology, especially these popular stories about Oirot prince, again. So they were sharing with people these stories about Oirot, the glorious prince that would come and save them from Russian colonization, from assaults of administrators who wanted to squash their self-government, okay. Oirot, in many respects, was this personification of or the Oirot nomadic confederation that existed, as I said, until the 1750s, been destroyed by the Manchu, okay. The real founder of this movement was certain Tiri Akimchi, in translation from Altaian means white Hillier. Again, see the white symbol of purity. He worked in a Russian diplomatic mission in Urga. Then he was trained in several Mongol monasteries, okay. He spoke, read and wrote Russian. He spoke Mongol. So he comes back to Altai and he picks up certain humble shepherds, common folk, and using them as the mouthpiece of the new faith he preached. Again, this new faith, the gist of this new faith was elements of Tibetan Buddhism, which this white Hillier propagated among Altaians. But since he was an Altaian, so he mixed these traits of Mongol Buddhism with old shamanism, although formally he denounced shamanism as the black faith. So it was a syncretic cult. We have visible traits of Tibetan Buddhism in Altai. So members of Ak-Jang adopted Buddhist calendars, okay. They adopted Buddhist paraphernalia. It began from this famous Buddhist bells. It comes to the very behavior of the people, members of the new faith. So they tried to be humble, to be peaceful. They started to denounce these numerous spirits that shamans wanted to utilize. As you know, shamans utilized a lot of spirits during the spiritual session, but here we have the opposite movement. We don't need so many spirits. We have Burkan, okay, Buddha. We have Oirot, and by the way, Oirot, this mythological figure, the embodiment of the historical Oirot state, he also became one of the major deities in this new religious movement, white faith. Okay, we also have a few old shamanic deities which were cleansed, and eventually they were allowed to enter white milk faith as well, which is also typical, because if you explore how Buddhism was expanding in Tibet, you have the same system, absorbing the several shamanic deities, prominent shamanic deities into Tibetan Buddhism, along with the new so-called new deities. They came from outside, okay, and plus incorporating mythological historical characters. So what are we talking about here? So what I'm trying to say in my talk, in scholarly literature about this Burkhanism, white faith, we have this typical view. It's presented as indigenous ethno-religious movement based most on shamanism, okay, with minor traits of Mongol Buddhism and minor traits of Orthodox Christianity. So that's visually I tried to show this influence as traditional scholarship viewed it. So shamanism was like a major presence, and the minor traits of Buddhism and a little bit of Orthodox Christianity. So my point is different. So I'm trying to argue the totally opposite. Okay, I'm not the only one to argue this point, but I'm trying to make this point by using Western Mongolia. So you will see that I will be emphasizing transnational, so transregional nature of Ak-Jang, okay, unlike many other scholars. So my view, my argument is that white faith was not actually parochial ethno-religious faith, okay. It's not only about ethno-religious revival. It's not only about ethnicity. It was used for ethnicity building. In reality, it was deeply linked to Western Mongolia. So we have here, I don't find here Christian influences. Okay, one of the traits, supposedly Christian influences, was that the daughter of Chet-Chelpan, that was formerly the founder of the faith, used by educated Altaians to propagate this faith. The daughter of Chet-Chelpan supposedly saw Oirot riding a white horse in a white robe, and since this girl, a little 12-year-old girl, was the first to bring this faith, some historians and anthropologists assumed that she was viewed like a maiden or something like this. So that's how they tried to argue that there was a trait of Christianity here. Okay, so my argument is that white faith was actually an integral part of Altai Mongolian prophetic movement that started at the end of the 19th century and extended well into the 1920s. And visually, see, look at the slide and you will see how I try to kind of shift my accents. We have two biggest empires going down. Okay, it was a very important element that destroyed the barriers to the spread of white faith. Okay, 1911, Manchu Empire went down, died in 1917. 6 years later, the Russian Empire dies, and it created this vacuum of power, spiritual power, administrative power in borderlands, and that's what worked well for Altaian Buddhism. So we have direct links with Mongolia. The border was not policed until 1929. Okay, literally, it was like a corridor, and Altaians and Mongols interacted with each other. In fact, there was a road called Chuya Tract, Chuya Road. It was the major trade route that connected West Mongolia and Altai. Okay, and many prominent members of the white faith They were simultaneously merchants, traders who traveled back and forth between West Mongolia and Altai. What many scholars don't pay attention to, and that's the new thing I'm trying to bring to your attention. Simultaneously, when White Faith movement was unfolding in Altai, and it was heavily studied by Russian anthropologists and some Western anthropologists, what was going on in the Russian part. But simultaneously in Western Mongolia, we have so-called Ja-Lama movement, 1910 to 1923. Okay, here, as I said, was the fear of Chinese land and cultural advances. Okay, here in West Mongolia, we have so-called Amursana prophecy. Okay, occasionally, by the way, the same Amursana prophecy was also called Irot prophecy, but mostly Amursana prophecy. Again, what was Amursana prophecy? Same story. There was an old prince, Amursana, actually a real character, the last prince of Irot Confederation, who escaped to the north, see north, okay. He started to serve Bala Khan, so Maiden Tsarina, Maiden Khan, that was the name for Elizabeth. And from there, from the north, he would come to save Western Mongolia from the advancement of the Chinese. Okay, see, the same prophecy, only salvation was coming from north, okay, from Russia. For Mongols, it was from Russia. For Altaians, salvation was coming from the south. Okay, so that is why some of the communities, Altaian communities, actually escaped to Mongolia in 1916, escaping from Russian administration, from conscription. They tried to find salvation in Mongolia, where supposedly their Irot motherland. Whereas for Western Mongolia, it was Amursana / Irot that would come from the north. In fact, according to according to local beliefs, this Prince Amursan, when he came, he would don a Russian military uniform. Okay, so that is why the preacher, one of the popular preachers who actually declared that I am Amursana, okay, his name was Ja-Lama, he donned the Russian Tsarist uniform, and occasionally he showed it to his followers to emphasize that he was the one who came to save his Oirot people. Okay, and by the way, here in Western Mongolia, this prophecy, Amursana prophecy, served as the spiritual foundation for national liberation movement, so to speak, ethnicity building in Western Mongolia. This prophecy did not exist, of course, in Khalkha in Eastern Mongolia. Okay, so because of ethnic differences and different historical baggage. In Ja-Lama movement, this Ja-Lama, this imposter who came in 1910 to West Mongolia and declared himself Prince Amursana, he used actually this prophecy for this local separatism. Okay, so we essentially have striking similarities between Amursana prophecy and Oirot prophecy, simply because these two areas were part of the same Oirot confederation. Okay, and the only difference that in West Mongolia we have a bunch of Tibetan Buddhists, but in Altai we have a kind of budding, emerging Tibetan Buddhists. Okay, kind of novices, new kids on the block who are coming to Buddhism. Essentially the same story. Okay, same story. In the borderland areas between Mongolia and Altai, people actually simultaneously use these two names, Irot and Amursana. Okay, it's like a same synonyms for the same thing, for the same prophet. Here you can see Ja-Lama, this person, okay, imposter, whose biography is murky, and one of my colleagues from Samara University, Dr. Chetyrova, she actually was able in Astrakhan, in the Volga area, to find some, in local archive, to find a police file for Ja-Lama, okay, because he was arrested. He was arrested in 1913 by Russian Cossacks because he declared, I'm a Russian subject, I'm a Mursana. I served the Russian Tsar and now I came to save Mongols, okay. He was also declared the reincarnation of Mahakala. So these were the two spiritual twins, Ayarot and Amursan prophecies. They served the same purposes of nation building, okay. And since we have this vacuum of power, okay, both prophecies were used to kind of bring people together. In case of Altai against Russians, in case of Mongols, in case of people of Western Mongolian indigenous people against the Chinese, okay. But the point I'm trying to make as far as the Russian Altai concerned is that through this ethnicity building, Buddhism was gradually coming to Altai, entrenching itself in Altai, okay, because it fulfilled both spiritual and administrative role, okay, as a source of unification for Altaians, okay. So Ak-Jang, the White Faith, and Ja-Lama movement were parts of the same spiritual realm, okay. That's the major point I'm trying to make. So we cannot examine this Burkhanism, this movement in Altai, in Russian Altai, White Faith or Milk Faith, without looking in what was going on in Western Mongolia, without looking into Ja-Lama movement, without looking into Western Mongol prophecies, spirituality. Okay, it was the same realm. Okay, these two persons were the most prominent examples. Actually, there was the bunch of other preachers, so to speak, who were wandering plains and mountains of Altai and West Mongolia, spreading Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in Tibetan Mongol, spreading legends about Amursan and Oerot. So the point I'm trying to make, we should not treat Altai and White Faith as a separate parochial movement. Okay, we should treat it as an integral part of what was going on in this area that should include West Mongolia. What put end to these spiritual exchanges between two areas was 1929, when the international border of the Soviet Union was totally sealed by Stalinism. Okay, so people could not communicate freely. The border was heavily policed, and in fact, White Faith was later in 1930s denounced as the bourgeois nationalism supported by Japan and China. So by default, it became the enemy faith, and many members of the milk faith, white milk faith, they were arrested to fulfill the quote of the secret police and ended up, of course, in Stalin's concentration camps. So that's the end of the story, and thank you for your attention.